Hello everyone, today I'm very honored to join co-teacher and present my recently conducted research entitled Integrating Ubiquitous Learning into Schema-Based Speaking Instruction. Here is the outline of my presentation. So I will quickly go over the rationale and the literature review. So the rationale for my study is that the traditional foreign language classroom was criticized to be independent and unfamiliar to learners, and so is claimed to be artificial, rigid, and unresponsive to the needs of the learner and as well as the society. And in that situation, the use of technology into the language classroom has fostered educational innovation and transformed, and it's also facilitated active learning. So, under the framework of active learning, the learner's role was shifted from passive recipients to active language consumers. Besides the use and implementation of computer system, which caused some difficulties to the teachers and also the learner. The use of mobile phone in foreign language classroom is more potential because it's more acceptable to the teachers and the learner, and it's better in terms of availability because you can see nowadays a lot of people have a handheld devices, and it requires less digital competencies to operate, and so it can foster the active learning better. However, although we are aiming at active learning and learner-centered approach, the material itself are still decided and designed by teachers. So in my opinion, the learners need to be assigned more active roles in the learning process. If we really want to aim at learner-centered approach. And instead of giving or providing the learner with a lot of strategies and knowledge and input from the teacher, we should give them more opportunity to have a generative learning or self-regulated learning. And in addition, the language learning should be positioned in the learner context, and the learner's real-life experience in authentic settings are the synonym for effective learning. Therefore, this study uses learner-generated materials from ubiquitous learning environment to enhance their learning experience and engagement in speaking. So, what is generative learning? So, generative learning is a theory that postulates that learning is a generative process. It was initiated by Whitrock from 1974, and in generative learning, learners are treated as an active agent who try to make sense of the input. So generative learning depends not only on how information is presented to the learner, but on how learners try to make sense of it. So, generative learning strategies are intended to improve learners' learning by prompting them to actively make sense of the material to be learned. Generative learning happens when the learner mentally engaged in deeper cognitive processing of material. And when deep learning or generative learning occurs when the students are encouraged to engage in productive learning activity. Therefore, this study uses schema approach. Among different approach, this study uses schema theory approach of generative learning and focusing on what the learner can do to foster generative learning. And the generative learning in this study is exhibited by the learning strategy that the student regulated during their learning process. So this is the the concept map of generative learning strategies for your reference. So why I want to choose the schema theory approach to foster generative learning, and why I want to propose the use of learner-generated material. So from the schema theory perspective, all new perceptual input is analyzed by comparing it with items which are already in our memory store and which are familiar from the past experience. Because our schema are partly acquired from our personal experience, our perception and memory of any given stimulus will be unique to each individual person. So, in other words, each student will come to the class with the self-schemas. So, different people will perceive the same input in different ways because this is the process of constructing the knowledge. So the knowledge is different from the information. The information might be the same, but the knowledge stored and acquired by each individual is quite different because it is driven by their schemas. So during the pre-service teacher training process, the teachers are reminded of schema theory, and they are required or encouraged to provide the learner with the background knowledge of the lesson. However, it's a quite challenging and almost really hard or impossible to scaffold learner with appropriate types and amount of background knowledge that matches their prior knowledge. Why it is so difficult? Because in terms of the types of background knowledge or prior knowledge, we really don't know what they have already known and what they have yet to know to provide them with their appropriate types. And in terms of the amount of background knowledge, it's really hard to evaluate which amount is enough, because if we provide the learner with too little background knowledge, they will find it hard to comprehend the input. However, if we provide them with too much background knowledge, it may become redundancy because it may hinder the generative learning. Theoretically said, generative learning just can be aroused if the learner are motivated to take part or to engage in the meaning-making process. And activity design, so a short activity design by schema theory include those that remind learner of prior knowledge and relate the information to what the learners already know. And in literature, when reviewing the previous study, the studies on generative learning mainly focus on the instructional methods, and they mainly tested the effectiveness of an instructed generative learning strategy. So in their study, the teachers will train or guide the learner to apply generative learning strategies in their learning with the hope that they may improve their learning outcome. So most study only focused on reading skill. I found some on listening skill with very few on speaking skill. And previous studies mainly measure learning outcome while learning process and learner preferences were omitted. And learner were instructed generative learning strategies and apply the strategy in response to a given test. So the main test or the main input information were still given by the teachers, and what the learner had to do is to apply the guided or trained generative learning strategies to assist the comprehension of the input. So in my opinion, the learner role in this process is still semi-active. It's not a real active knowledge composer. So this study advocate the use of ubiquitous learning, and I focus on the learner-generated materials to replace the photos from the textbook, and I will focus on the speaking task. So why I want to advocate the use of ubiquitous learning, and I believe that this technique will enhance or trigger the generative learning in the learning process, because ubiquitous learning is a learning environment that empower learner more active role in the process of learning knowledge construction. So this notion is in line with the generative learning. So it assigns the learner a more active roles in the learning process. And the well-designed ubiquitous learning environment should be highly adaptive based on the student prior knowledge and existing performance to provide proper guidance or apprenticeship for each learner. So this is in line with the schema theory approach in generative learning. And ubiquitous learning also offers context familiarity, in which the learner explore their living environment to self-explain, select, organize the material that they formulate for the lesson. So this is indeed a process of generative learning. And self-generated learning material, the self-taken photo in this study, are initiated from the learner perception, and they will match perfectly with their self-schemas. And when learners generate material in the e-learning environment, and they will potentially engage in the generative processing. And I want to focus on the learning engagement because engagement was evident to have a positive correlation with the learning outcome. And we have three types of learning environment: behavioral environment, emotional engagement, and cognitive engagement. And here I want to focus on cognitive engagement exhibited by the learning strategies and self-regulation learning strategies. So what are the learning strategies? Learning strategies are the specific action taken by the learner to make learning easier, faster, more enjoyable, more self-directed, more effective, more transferable to new situation. So it's also a type of active learning. And language learning strategies are behavior, steps, or techniques that language learner apply to facilitate language learning. And it's evident that the individuals who take a more strategic approach learns more rapidly and effectively than individuals who do not. So that's why I want to focus on learning strategies. So this study is guided by the two research questions formulated from the research gap in the literature review and also from the rationale. So the first question is, to what extent do learner-generated photos enhance their satisfaction? So this is about the learning process and learner feeling. And to what extent do learner-generated photos enhance learner engagement? And the methods the participants of this study were 22 college students. They were at B1 level and they were working to at B2 level. And the task that I collected data and I focused on is the prompted speaking task. It was similar to the task 3 of the first certificate English exam. And there are two types of material employed in this study. The first one is the textbook provided photos as usual, and the second one is the experimental condition is the learner generated photo. So in this condition, the learners were encouraged to explore the living environment, take photos which are relevant to a given topic that the teachers gave them, and select two photos among on the photo taken to bring to the class for practice. And the same 22 college students were assigned to both learning conditions to minimize their individual differences. So here are some examples of the student taken photos. So this is the procedure of the experiment. So in the first week was the introductory week, and they went through the two trial weeks to see if there were any problem emerging from the process, and then they will have a 2 week of learning. The first week they learned with the textbook photo as usual, and they do the strategies questionnaire 1. And the second week they learned with self-generated photo, and they will do strategies question 2, and they also did the satisfaction questionnaire. So for the course satisfaction is where the sample instrument is with a 7-point like a scale from 1 to 7. So the first statement is, I am satisfied with the material and I am satisfied with the learning session, and I use the same two statements into learning conditions. And I use the learning strategies taken from the self-regulated learning strategies questionnaire by Duncan Pintrick. And there are two subscale of strategies. The first one is cognitive and metacognitive strategies, and the second one is resource management strategies. And I just use the descriptive analysis, thematic coding for the elaboration on these two ones, and also for the Pearson Pretty test to compare the MSLQ in two conditions. Okay, so this is the reliability of the three questionnaires. So as for the learner satisfaction, we can see that the learner feel more satisfied with the learning condition that they were allowed to use the photo taken by themselves. So in terms of the satisfaction of the material, it was really high. The gap was really big. And for the learning session in general, there was also some difference, although the difference were not significant, but we can see descriptively here. And for the elaboration, I used the thematic coding, and they just gave me some very brief explanation. And the most common explanation were they felt that they were more engaged in the task, and they felt that there were more interaction in the condition that they were allowed to use the photo, and they felt that the photo was more familiar to their context, their life, their surrounding, and they were happy because they could choose their own photos in the classroom. And as for the two strategies questionnaire, these are the pair sympathy test of each scale, and you can see that for the critical thinking, there was a marginal significant result, and for the effort regulation, the result was significantly different. So, in the textbook provided photo, the learner uh, had to operate a lot of effort regulation strategies rather than in the learner-generated photo. However, for the peer learning, uh, the the learner-generated photo condition recorded a better peer learning strategy. That means there were, and it's also complying with the elaboration of the learner that they felt that they had more interactions in this condition. So the first one, the first condition discussion that can interpret it from the result is that the learner-generated photo enhanced learning engagement. It was reflected by their reflection as well as regulated learning strategy, and this result is in line with this study. And learner-generated photo has significant effect in peer learning strategy. So that means it can foster collaboration and interaction in the foreign language classroom, and in foreign language classrooms specifically, interaction is really important that we all know about it. And learner-generated photos slightly assisted critical thinking and metacognitive self-regulation. And learner apply less effort regulation strategies when learning with self-taken photo because it have reduced their mental effort in doing tasks. They don't have to reserve their effort to complete the task because they know about the picture and they can confidently talk about it. And learner-generated photo improve the learner's satisfaction about the learning, which may subsequently boost their motivation. And learner-generated photo made the material to be more appropriate to the learner prior knowledge because they felt that it was more familiar to their content to them. And the learner-generated photo represent the tendency of learner autonomy in ubiquitous learning condition because they felt happy because they were allowed to use their own photos. So it's also a sign of learner autonomy. So in conclusion, this study proved the role of prior knowledge and learner-generated learning in enhancing learner engagement and their learning experience by including their prior knowledge into the learning process, particularly the learning material. And the result proved that empowering learner a more active role in the learning process will yield positive effects. And the limitation is that it's still a pilot study, so sample size was rather small. And besides the learning preference and satisfaction, learning outcome should also be measured to estimate the effectiveness of this approach. After this study, I also acknowledge the limitation that I should also measure the outcomes. So I continued doing the same experiment but a different group of learners. This time I have 23 students because it's kind of a typical class size of that program. And I also measure the speaking outcome, and I also have a kind of extra result that I really want to share with you. So in term of the learner psychology, I measure the cognitive load, the perceived difficulty, and the preferences. In terms of the speaking performance, I measure the fluency and lexical complexity. For the fluency, I measure the number of words per minute, number of syllables per minute, the number of T unit, and the mean length of T unit. And also, for lexical complexity, I measure the lexical density and number of different words and the type token ratio. And so for the psychological factors, so we can see that the fluctuation. So for the cognitive load, if the learner were allowed to learn with their own photo, so they don't the cognitive load was really low, like this. Okay, and if they use the textbook photo because the speaking tests were really hard, so it's their cognitive load was really high. That means they have to invest a lot of mental effort in task completion. And also they prefer the learning mode with the pictures with their own photos with the similar reasons. And okay, And also for the speaking outcome, we can see that there were significant difference in various measurements. So that means that the learner-generated photo did help them improve the speaking. But the learner-generated photo is not like one size fits all, so it doesn't take effect across a condition. So it just take effect it's mostly take effect in the condition when the task complexity was relatively low. In this study, I designed the two level of task complexity. So the first one just require the learner to have a lower order thinking, like just is describing. But in the later condition, they have to compare and contrast the two photos, so it's quite higher level higher order thinking. So the learner generated learning that initiated from the learner prior knowledge should take effect when the task was relatively simple. So in conclusion, what I wanted to propose in this current study is that the first one, we should empower the learner the more active role in the learning process, and if possible, we may assign them as a material creator or material provider instead of teacher trying to provide everything. I think it will have the learner engaged more in the learning process, and the result of my studies also advocate and prove that notion. And also, I also think that the result of those studies also highlight the importance of context familiarity in the language learner. So the authenticity of the material, on one hand, it can expose the learner with the culture of the countries or the context of the target language, but it also casts a lot of difficulties to the learner learning process because they don't really know about the cultural features of the target language. So apart or besides the authentic, but besides using authentic material, we also need to give learner more opportunities to include their content, their local content, their familiar content into the learning process. Okay, thank you for your listening. And this is the end of my presentation.